tonight we struck lucky, really, because we arranged speakers a few weeks in advance, hoping that the subject about which we're going to talk is going to be topical. And today, three things have happened which make the appearance of Dr. Paul Monk very special. First of all, as some of you know, this afternoon North Korea exploded a nuclear device underground at about 3:30, which of course does raise the temperature in North Asia and helps us focus yet again on defense issues there. Secondly, Julia Gillard announced, if we're to believe the Australian this morning, that she's going to seek a better relationship with China when she goes to China, I think in March, for a summit meeting there, and hopes to meet the Chinese leadership. And this begs the question of what Australia's attitude to China should be. Should we be, of course, seeking to improve our relationship with China? Of course, that's common sense, but also should we be seeking to take up issues like human rights and also try and encourage those who want to push for a reform agenda in China? And then thirdly, it's also in the news that a general in the Peking and the People's Army, admittedly a general who got passed over in the recent reshuffle, has been issuing rather stern warnings against Japan, raising again the temperature of the rhetoric in the dispute between China and Japan. So it's very appropriate, Paul, that we have you here this evening, and we welcome you. Dr. Paul Monk is a former head of the Chinese section of the Australian Defence Intelligence Organisation up in Canberra, and now is the managing director of AusThink, which is a consultancy in Melbourne. He's come up from Melbourne especially for this occasion tonight. He also is the author of many articles on China, including one called Taming the Dragon, which we trailed in our promotion for this event, which was published not too long ago in Quadrant. And he's also written a book called Thunder from the... Oh, I can't read this, my glasses are bad, but Thunder from the Silent Zone, that's right. And that of course is about China. So we warmly welcome you here and invite you to talk to us.
Thanks, Colin. I think some of you might have had a flutter of concern when Colin just announced that I used to be the head of the Chinese section of the Defence Intelligence Organisation. There isn't one yet to my knowledge, but I'm sure they're working on it in Beijing. When informed on landing that the North Koreans had detonated a nuclear weapon, because I'd been in mid-air when it occurred or when the news broke, a thought crossed my mind that I sort of had to check, is this April Fool's Day? Because on April Fool's Day, back in 1992, when I was not yet head of the China analysis section of the Defence Intelligence Organisation, but I was Japan and Korea's desk officer, it was April Fool's Day, and nobody, we were getting to just about noon, nobody had cracked an April Fool's joke. And I was a little surprised by this. And so I went into a couple of the military guys on the team and I said, no, it's 5 to 12 and nobody's made an April Fool's joke. I guess we're all just too serious and busy. And I said, yeah, I guess so. And then just went back to work. So I said, okay, so you've been working hard. So I assume, because you've been so hard-working this morning, you picked up that report about North Korean commandos crossing the DMZ. And the young corporal said, oh no, what? I said, got you just in time. But it seems the North Koreans did indeed set off a nuclear explosion, and that is an interesting one. It's not something, needless to say, that I had factored into my prepared remarks, but I'm sure when Q&A comes, there'll be occasion to talk about it. I've prepared a written address as my habit. I've often said, if you're always talking about essentially the same subject, if you're campaigning, running for office, then you can develop a routine whereby you know pretty much what you're going to say. You have a stock of anecdotes and certain stock phrases, you have policies to announce. Whenever I give a talk, I prepare a new one. And I haven't yet mastered the art of learning it by heart in short order and then just delivering as it were, extempore. So if you bear with me, I will read the presentation. It'll go for about 20-25 minutes, and I think that'll leave us a reasonable amount of time for questions and discussion, which I look forward to very much. One Saturday evening in late January, I sat down for a quiet dinner with a small group of friends who have been back and forth to China many times, since the 1970s in some cases. Each is deeply knowledgeable about China and fluent in Mandarin. None of them is what you would normally think of as being hawkish, and none is anti-Chinese. On the contrary, though my affinity with them is rooted in their never having been apologists for Mao Zedong, my regard for them has been strengthened over years by the fact that they clearly, each in his or her own way, exhibited a rich appreciation of the Chinese world. Things that were said over that dinner, given the backgrounds of the group, were quite disturbing. There was an almost rattled sense that over the past 10 years or more, the Communist Party has been leading China in an ominous direction. They had heard more and more jingoistic and warmongering talk from supposedly well-informed and responsible Chinese business people and officials in recent years, and fears were expressed that China is preparing for war, especially against Japan. China intends to overthrow the Pax Americana in Asia and to break up America's alliances, it was agreed. Several of them drew attention to recent statements by Chinese military officers to the effect that China must revitalize its military traditions, since history is built on blood and thunder. One drew attention to the statement by the new Chinese President Xi Jinping to military officers that the PLA must be ready for war. Another said he had come across evidence that the Communist Party has been using front companies to buy up Chinese community radio and newspapers, both here and elsewhere in the West, and use them for party propaganda among the Chinese diaspora. Yet another, himself of Chinese origin, said his own parents talk at home of democracy being rubbish and China ascending to a dominant position in world affairs. It occurred to me that this conversation might provide the plot point for an espionage novel or contemporary thriller of some kind. John Buchan's The 39 Steps comes to mind. Perhaps because Buchan described the novel, written in 1915, as a shocker, explaining that he meant an adventure where the events in the story are unlikely and the reader is only just able to believe that they're really happening. The novel, his novel, is set in May, June 1914. The hero, Richard Hannay, has just returned to London from Rhodesia in order to begin a new life, when a freelance spy called Franklin Scudder calls on him to ask for help against a German spy ring called the Black Stone, which plans to steal British contingency plans for war in Europe. Needless to say, I'm not a freelance spy and was not seeking the assistance of my friends against anything resembling the Black Stone. Nor do I anticipate any of them being pursued, like Richard Hannay, the length and breadth of the country by the servants of a sinister foreign power. I make mention of Buchan only because the nature of the conversation that night had a dramatic character, and famous novels are very often the simplest means for enlivening the imagination to the human realities of a complex situation. What I've been asked to discuss with you this evening is Australia's security in the context of the rise of Chinese power. And the most important point I wish to impress upon you is that that dinner conversation arose because all around the world now, similar conversations are being held. There is a completely real drama starting to play out, though, like a reader of Buchan, you may be only just able to believe that it is really happening. Let me offer just a handful of illustrations of what I mean when I say that all around the world, conversations are now taking place similar to the one I had in late January with my friends in Melbourne. In just the past fortnight, Kevin Rudd has come out with the portentous statement that Asia has become a tinderbox on water, reminiscent of the Balkans in 1913. A leading China specialist here in Sydney, Linda Jacobson, has warned that China risks lurching into war with its neighbours if it is unable to rein in domestic tensions and nationalist ambitions. In the United States, trade and development specialist Clyde Prestowitz has warned that Chinese hacking into major US newspapers is further proof that China is acting in a warlike manner. Senior US Naval Intelligence Officer James Fennell has declared that China is becoming dangerously aggressive and ambitious and is intent on being able to win naval battles on the high seas. The Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has appealed to China to show restraint in the East China Sea. India has warned that it will send naval units to the South China Sea to support Vietnam in its disputes with China over maritime territories. In this context, a senior Chinese military officer has warned darkly that the US is acting as the global tiger, leading Japan, Asia's wolf, in mauling China. He has urged that Australia should not become, quote, a jackal for the tiger or dance with the wolf. We have an unprecedented number of prominent Australians also urging very publicly that we should think long and hard before aligning ourselves with Japan or the United States against China, not just over Taiwan, but at all. Such alignment, we are told, would be contrary to our thriving trade relationship with China, would risk drawing us into an appalling and surely avoidable conflict, and would indeed increase the likelihood of such a conflict by stoking Chinese fears that the US was building an alliance to contain or suppress it. Seen in this context, the dinner conversation was not a shocker in Buchan's sense, it was a taste of reality. But reality in such matters is wonderfully more complex than it is in popular novels. And my task here is not to outline a scenario in which the events are unlikely or only just illegal. Rather, it is to address the complexity of our situation to the best of my ability and to encourage reflection on the dilemmas and uncertainties which confront our cherished and unusual country as we look ahead to 2014 and beyond. I shall begin with a few remarks about Kevin Rudd's suggestion that Asia in 2013 bears an unsettling resemblance to the Balkans of exactly 100 years ago. That is, to the situation which led to the First World War. After describing the geography of current tensions between China and Japan, China and Vietnam, China and the Philippines, Rudd concludes his reflection, quote, in his recent book, The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914, historian Christopher Clark recounts how the petty nationalisms of the Balkans combusted with great power politics and failed statesmanship at the time to produce the industrial-scale carnage of World War I. This was a time when economic globalization was even deeper than it is today, and when the governments of Europe, right up until 1914, had concluded that a pan-European war was irrational and therefore impossible. I believe a pan-Asian war is extremely unlikely. Nonetheless, for those of us who live in this region, facing escalating confrontations in the East China and South China Seas, Europe is a cautionary tale very much worthy of reflection. End of quote. When I read these lines, three thoughts immediately crossed my mind. The first was that even a former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister who speaks Mandarin remains sufficiently Eurocentric as to find in Christopher Clark's 2012 book his most troubling antecedent for our current situation. The second was that Rudd's Eurocentrism reminded me of a draft paper by Gareth Evans 20 years ago, sent to me in the Defence Intelligence Organisation for comment, in which our then Foreign Minister declared that things were now more peaceful in Asia than at any time since the end of the 30 Years' War. I was astonished by that observation at the time, and I still shake my head at it. The 30 Years' War, of course, had not touched Asia at all. China was still ruled by the Ming Dynasty at that time, and Japan had just gone into its Tokugawa hibernation. The third thought that crossed my mind was that if you really wanted to get some depth of perspective on war and peace in Asia over the past century, and the roots of present tensions, you'd do far better to read S.C.M. Payne's The Wars for Asia, 1911 to 1949, published late last year, than Christopher Clark's book. Payne is Professor of Strategy and Policy at the US Naval War College. His previous work includes the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, Perceptions, Power and Primacy, 2003, which has important lessons for strategists in the Asia-Pacific in this decade, and 3 edited volumes, Naval Blockades and Sea Power, 2006, Naval Coalition Warfare, 2008, and Naval Power and Expeditionary Warfare, 2011. It astonishes me that our former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, even sitting on the backbenches with a little more time to contemplate things than in his halcyon globe-trotting days, should have chosen to read Clark rather than Payne. It pains me, you might say. Payne's work over the past decade has been marvellously targeted at distilling from a detailed study of Asia's recent past the possible strategic lessons for the early 21st century. We in Australia have spent at least 20 years, 40 if you date it from Gough Whitlam's decision to open diplomatic relations with Marx China, pondering our strategic future as a European enclave in a rising Asia. We have pondered this in a rather desultory and unsystematic fashion, despite a few clarion voices urging that we think harder and deeper. And here we are in 2013, and Kevin Rudd, of all people, still takes his strategic lessons from books on European rather than Asian history. Far be it from me, a long-time student of European history, to decry the reading of Clark's book. But truly, it is Asia, not Europe, in which our strategic future will be decided, and Asia has its own history. Let's study that while we can. Payne's central thesis in his new book is that Americans have for too long failed to understand the linkages between the Chinese Civil War, the Japanese invasion of China from 1931, and the Second World War, in which Japan attacked America, while the Soviet Union held aloof until Hitler had been defeated and then invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria and seized Sakhalin. None of these conflicts, he argues, can be adequately understood unless the relationship between them is comprehended. We can add to this that the roots of present Sino-Japanese rivalry and mutual mistrust go back right through the period Payne covers in this book, and further still, into the era and the war covered in his 2003 book on the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. It's not my intention to provide here and now a lecture on all this history. I'll make one or two brief remarks about it, but my chief purpose in mentioning Payne's work is to draw attention to the appalling lack of focus in this country on the history of the region in which we happen to live. The chief remark I want to make concerning the relevance of the Asian wars of the first half of the 20th century to our current situation has to do with the economic context in which those wars occurred. It is often remarked, and Rudd makes this point again in his recent piece, that on the eve of the First World War, the world economy was more globalized than it was to be again until the recent past. It is also often remarked that the Great Depression was a major cause of international militarization in the 1930s, but seldom do we pause to study how this played out in our own region. We need to be reminded that Japan, from the Meiji Restoration in 1868 until the Great Depression, sought to emulate the West, industrialize as efficiently as possible, and become a prospering and respected member of the global comedy of modern states. It did, during those decades, something strikingly similar to what China has done since 1978. As it industrialized, Japan sought resource security and markets for its manufactures. It was troubled and frustrated by the failure of the Qing Empire to reform and modernize, and by the chaos in China after the downfall of the dynasty. It took Taiwan and Korea from the Qing in 1895 and pursued a policy of the systematic economic development of those countries in the decades that followed. Long before it invaded Manchuria in 1931, it invested heavily and purposefully there. As Payne points out, prior to that invasion, Japan accounted for 72% of all foreign investment in Manchuria, while Russia, or the Soviet Union, accounted for another 24%. Great Britain, the next largest foreign investor, controlled just 1%. He then comments, industrial development in the rest of China lagged far behind Manchuria, which accounted for 90% of China's oil, 70% of its iron, 55% of its gold, and 33% of its trade. Why then did Japan decide to go to the enormous expense of invading Manchuria in 1931 and then the whole of China in 1937, to say nothing of then launching all-out war on the United States and trying to annex the whole of Southeast Asia in 1941-42? The answer is not simple, and the most far-sighted statesmen in Japan at the time opposed these steps. But at the heart of the matter lies the disruption to the global economy, and therefore to Japan's sense of economic security that came with the Great Depression after the 1929 Wall Street crash. Even as the Depression hit Japan's markets in the early 1930s, there were important debates there about its options. There was general agreement that stability and prosperity in China were highly desirable. The question was how to foster them. Many civilian leaders, Payne points out, recommended cooperation with the West to stabilize China gradually, and recommended domestic rather than military spending in order to build the infrastructure and industrial base for national prosperity and for military modernization. But the militarists prevailed, in part because they drew upon Japanese martial traditions, but chiefly because the Great Depression made the situation seem ever more urgent and the West an ever less plausible partner. The Wall Street crash and the protectionism that it triggered around the world resulted in Japanese exports dropping by 50% between late 1929 and late 1931. In China itself, the nationalist government steeply increased tariffs between 1927 and 1931, generating a great deal of revenue for itself, but hammering Japanese exports to China. Western protectionism discredited those civilian economists and political leaders who had urged cooperation with the West for so long. Manchuria was seen by the militarists as Japan's absolute lifeline. The chaos in China meant that only Japanese control there could preserve Japanese interests, so they argued. There was also the danger that the Soviet Union would take it over or sponsor the Chinese communists to do so, which they said would be a compound disaster. At the height of intense national policy debates, Japanese newspaper editorials asked why it was legitimate in the eyes of the West for Britain to rule India or the United States to rule the Philippines, but not for Japan to rule Manchuria or Korea. Foreign Minister Shidehara Kijuo, Payne notes, compared Japanese interests in Manchuria to US interests in the Panama Canal Zone, areas where neither power brooked treaty infringements. In debates at the League of Nations in 1933, Japanese representatives argued that a unified China had ceased to exist with the death of Yuan Shikai in 1915, and that only those in the West with little stake in China could afford to indulge in the generous fiction that China was a single organised entity. There was a serious risk of communism taking over China, they warned, and their protectorate in Manchuria could serve as a buffer against such a possibility. As Payne remarks, there were no takers. This is not the time or place to explore all that followed in Asia from Japan's fateful decision to annex Manchuria. I've made these few observations simply to invoke the strategic past that does, unlike the history of the Balkans 100 years ago, sit at the root of our current dilemmas and dangers in this part of the world. Unless it has failed to occur to you listening to these recollections of the 1930s in Asia, let me spell out that China in our time is engaged in very much the same kind of enterprise as was Japan before the Great Depression. It has been industrializing as rapidly and efficiently as it can as a matter of closely guided state policy. It has been seeking ever greater access to natural resources and markets for its manufacturers. It has, to a considerable extent, at least until 2008, seen itself as emulating the West in these respects. And it has become part of a globalized economy that has encouraged and so far largely welcomed its economic rise. Where Japan invested in Manchuria, China is investing in Africa, Latin America, and to the greatest extent possible, Australia, in extractive industries and the infrastructure that goes with them. If you have not done so already, I urge you to read Dambisa Moyo's Winner Take All, China's Race for Resources and What It Means for Us, published like Clark's and Payne's books in 2012. The scale of what is happening is breathtaking, and we are a significant, though ultimately a relatively small part of the picture. Our economic and strategic future is bound up with all these things in a way that even our more thoughtful citizens and public figures seem only vaguely to have grasped. Ever since 2008, of course, we have been forced to contemplate a possible unravelling of the global economy, and a few voices have muttered ominously that this could lead to a reprise of the calamities of the 1930s and 1940s. But there were wars in Asia before 1911, which had a rising Japan defeat first China in 1894-95, and then Russia in 1904-05. These were not triggered by economic depression. They were triggered by economic rivalry. These are the kinds of antecedents we need to bear in mind as we debate our own country's strategic future and security dilemmas. These are the true antecedents to the tensions we are seeing now in Asia. These are the historical realities which loom behind my 39-step sense of my dinner table conversation in late January. Yet I'm not predicting the outbreak of war in Asia in 2014. I am, as a consultant in deliberative processes and decision theory, more than usually aware of the pitfalls of breezy or dramatic predictions, especially, as they say, when they concern the future. It is rather my habit to encourage people to be cognizant of complexity and of the ways in which the future is not predictable, but is subject to all manner of hazards and is shaped by the very choices we make, often in ways we have not so much as contemplated. I want therefore to talk briefly about scenarios rather than predictions. There is a very fine analyst of the psychology of predictions and political judgment named Philip Tetlock. He likes to describe analysts as falling somewhere on a spectrum between what he calls, echoing Isaiah Berlin, hedgehogs and foxes. A hedgehog, in Tetlock's terms, is someone confident that their intuitions or expertise enable them to see the future and warn, rally, or deter others. A fox, on the other hand, is someone who is cautious, sceptical, inclined more to circumspection than assertion, and intrigued by complexity more than impressed by the apparent simplicity of things. I am a fox to an almost pathological extent. I am profoundly sceptical about all passionate convictions, dogmas, ideologies, and inspired intuitions. I place a premium for just this reason on the subtleties and intricacies of things, on the importance of considered choices and the value of relentless cross-examination of assumptions. It was in this spirit that almost a decade ago I criticised the widespread tendency to what I called a linear ascent model regarding China's prospects. My close reasoning on the subject is set out in the third chapter of my 2005 book, Thunder from the Silent Zone, Rethinking China. I mention this here because China has certainly continued to grow rapidly since the book was published, but the complexities and divergent possibilities to which I drew attention then have only increased, and now more than ever we need to think in terms of various different scenarios in imagining the consequences of our choices and the range of our options. If I may be allowed to quote myself, a different self after all, as I've learned a great deal since Thunder from the Silent Zone was written and published years ago, in place of the linear ascent model, we should think of 4 models for change in China over the next generation. These might be labelled mutation, maturation, metastasis, and militarization. None is linear, and none entails an uninterrupted ascent to a Chinese-dominated 21st century. Mutation would involve a fundamental reshaping of the Chinese polity to cope with internationalization and a complex economy. Maturation would involve a flattening of the growth curve, but only to a level enabling China to cope with the enormous demands of a population that is unlikely to stabilise short of 1.7 billion by mid-century. Metastasis would occur if the multiple and formidable challenges facing the Chinese polity prove overwhelming and result in a collapse of the undertaking to modernise a unified China. The 4th model, militarisation, would involve a nationalist effort to cope with the stresses of rapid change and uncertainty through a massive increase in military power, much as Germany undertook before 1914 and Japan before 1941. Unquote. China's economic growth over the intervening years is prima facie evidence for a linear ascent, as is the continued and determined monopolisation of political power by the Communist Party. But there are many other variables at work, and choices made in the immediate future will contribute to shaping which scenario looks more plausible. The upheaval in China this time last year, when Sichuan kingpin and would-be neo-Maoist Bo Xilai fell from grace, exposed, writes John Garner in his pungent Little Penguin in 2012, The Rise and Fall of the House of Bo, quote, a world of staggering brutality, corruption, hypocrisy, and fragility, unquote. In fact, anyone who cared to look closely rather than avert his eyes had known this for many decades, but none other than Premier Wen Jiabao warned in March last year that the political demagoguery of Bo Xilai and his ruthless abuse of power were proof that China must democratise or face the danger of another catastrophe like the Cultural Revolution, which would undermine much of what has been gained in recent years. This was a glimpse through a window onto a possible metastasis scenario. Meanwhile, Chinese military expenditures have burgeoned even faster than its economy, and the hawkish rhetoric of some of its xenophobic nationalists, military and civilian alike, points to a possible militarization scenario. The exhaustion of its export-led growth model and the acknowledgement that it needs to transition to a different domestic consumption-led model point to dilemmas in macroeconomic policy that could usher in a maturation scenario, if not a metastasis one. What of mutation? The perennial question in the West since the days of Hu Yaobang in the mid-1980s has been when and how will China turn away from dictatorship to democracy? Xi Jinping's ascent to the presidency late last year has brought the usual round of pious hopes that he will find a way to reform and open the polity. But it is far from being a good bet. Indeed, such is the mood in much of China now that political leaders seeking to liberalise and to exercise greater restraint in relations with Japan and the United States might find himself at some risk of suffering the fate of liberal-minded Japanese leaders of the 1930s, assassination at the hands of nationalist and militarist fanatics. The fate of Japanese Finance Minister Takahashi Korekiyo is particularly poignant in this regard. Having stabilised the Japanese economy in the early to mid-1930s despite the Great Depression, he argued strongly against the rapid increase in defence spending and was murdered in February 1936 by soldiers screaming heavenly punishment. In any case, Xi Jinping, despite his genial smile, good English and familiarity with the United States, is no reforming liberal. Shortly after assuming the presidency, he took all members of his Politburo with him to the bizarre museum the party has built in Tiananmen Square, the Museum of National Humiliation and Revival. He pointed out to them the exhibits showing the arrival of the Jesuits via Macau in the 16th century and how this had been the beginning of the infiltration and humiliation of China by the West. He pointed out the exhibits showing the Japanese invasions of China and the unfounded assertion that they had been defeated by the Communist Party with a little bit of help from a few good nationalist generals. The Americans, he said, then became the enemy. Against this external enemy, he told China's inner group of top leaders, we must stick together. We are faced right now, not only with uncertainties in the relations between our Asian neighbours, but with considerable uncertainties about the behaviour of China and its capacity to handle its sudden rise to relative prosperity. We cannot afford to assume that all will be well, since it is becoming distinctly more bellicose. But neither would it make sense for us to assume the worst. Indeed, it isn't even clear what the worst would be. It has, however, been disturbing in recent years to see so many prominent Australians bandwagoning on the presumed China Express and declaring that the commodities boom would go on for decades, that China will dominate the 21st century and we need to come to terms with that we should edge away from our alliance with the United States because it entails too great a risk of antagonising China, and even that China could soon replace the United States as our great and powerful friend. We surely must seek, quietly and systematically, to ensure to the best of our ability that we will remain secure and at liberty to make our way in the world, regardless of what China does or wishes. Given all the uncertainties, both immediate and longer term, this is a serious challenge, and not one we can have any confidence in our present government delivering. I should add that that statement is not a politically partisan one. There is at the present time little reason to be any more confident of the coalition than of the current government in this regard. Over-reliance on commodity exports to China has skewed our economy. We have profited very considerably from it, but have largely squandered the proceeds. We have seen many European states and the Americans all but bankrupt themselves by giving greater priority to welfare entitlements and pork barrelling than to investment in innovation. Yet we are doing the same. We have swung erratically from a systematic upgrading of our defence forces to a draconian reduction in defence expenditure without any serious rationale being offered for the swing other than a preference to increase welfare measures at a time of shrinking revenues and yet still balance the budget. When I contemplate the nation in 2013, I see incoherence and disarray as regards both national security and macroeconomic policy alike, and it makes me increasingly uncomfortable. It does so because I have a rather deep-seated dislike for intellectual incoherence in general, but also because I see the current state of affairs as rooted in laziness, self-indulgence and political myopia. All this would be discomforting even if the international scene is quite rosy. That it is happening at a time when there are growing regional tensions and most of our neighbours are rapidly increasing their military capabilities, while China shows a considerable inclination to puff out its chest and insist on its prerogatives, is even more discomforting. I fear that we are adrift, and that no prospective helmsman is at hand to steer the ship of state back to a sound course. Perhaps that disquiet, that fear, as much as the disquiet of my group of friends, explains why I placed such an emphasis on my late January dinner conversation at the beginning of this set of remarks. But my observations grow out of far longer standing experience and wider reflection. I was running a defence-related workshop late last year when it was announced that Duncan Lewis had stepped down as Secretary of Defence. I and those with me were alike dismayed at this, since Mr. Lewis is universally held in the highest regard, and it was perfectly clear that his departure, though cloaked in a diplomatic appointment to Europe, was because of his unwillingness to accept the reckless cuts to the defence budget just announced by the Gillard government. There was some consolation in the thought that the competent and clear-headed Dennis Richardson was replacing him, but no one could envy Mr. Richardson his task. It is to be hoped that we will luck out in the next few years and that current tensions will not erupt into a conflict whose escalation might get out of hand. It is to be hoped that despite the wrenching changes in commodity markets, including China's recent announcement that it intends to sharply reduce its coal imports, will not so undermine Australian solvency that we get ourselves into budgetary difficulties. It is to be hoped that the government which comes to office next September will both command a workable legislative majority and will devise, if it does not yet have, serious plans for both investment in economic infrastructure and the funding of a coherent and sustained national security policy. It is to be hoped that the tax and spend mentality which has taken hold in Canberra does not take us too much further down the path followed by all too many OECD countries over the past generation. Entitlement-based consumption funded by ballooning national debt and shrinking national productivity. It is to be hoped, but I'm uneasy depending on hope. Neither national security nor economic planning should depend on hope. They should be based on a preparedness to face foreseeable challenges and the development of a capacity for resilience in the face of the unexpected or seriously threatening challenges. While recent developments in Asia do not point unambiguously to looming conflict, they do point to various possible dangers and considerable uncertainties. These are compounded in our case by our enormous exposure to the consequences of possible conflict to our north, because so much of our prosperity now depends on trade with the newly wealthy states of East Asia and on the security of the sea lanes that pass to them through the Indonesian archipelago, the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Our economic good fortune since the 1980s may explain, but it cannot excuse our collective loss of cohesion and seriousness in recent years as regards both our economic future and our national security. I had hopes in 2007 that the incoming Rudd government would reinvigorate both. I was disappointed. The Gillard government has been even worse, and the Abbott-led coalition has not persuaded me that it will rectify things. That is why my hope has gradually become unease. That was the unease I brought to my conversation with my friends returning, some of whom had returned from China in late January, and it is the unease I have come here to share with you this evening with a view to sparking a larger conversation. So let's now have that conversation and see where it takes us. I don't know what exactly was behind Joe Biden's remarks, but I would surmise that two things were going on. One is that there has been a school of thought in the United States, and I think in some circles in Western Europe, that one way to transcend their current economic difficulties is to deepen and renovate the relationship between those two huge economies, the EU and the United States. And perhaps also he meant that there is a cultural and strategic affinity between those two zones which can be relied upon and which should not be forgotten. I would be surprised if he meant to say that the pivot to Asia is off and that the US will not be standing up for Japan or repositioning its forces in the Western Pacific, because there's been no other signal that I'm aware of that that's happening. And certainly the strategic tensions and worries are in that part of the world right now, like Europe. So that would be my response to the question about Biden. Yes. The other aspect of it, it seems to me, is the US alliance in Australia. I think that one of the things far too many Australians have not thought about for a long time, perhaps not really believe they needed to think about, was the extent to which, for many decades, our defence spending and our attitude to our national security has free-ridden on US defence spending and maintenance of a global security order. It's been easy and at times inevitable, I suppose it's fair to say, to criticise certain aspects of what the US has done. But the reality of the matter is that Australia, like Japan, and like many of the Western European countries, basically thought, well, the Yanks are doing the heavy lifting, they're doing all the spending, we'll do just enough to reassure them that we're allies, and meanwhile we'll live comfortably. And I think that that's a self-indulgent attitude. I felt in the past decade, when we started to buttress our defence forces, that we were being a bit more responsible, and I'm appalled that all of a sudden, with no serious strategic rationale whatsoever, our defence spending has plummeted, and it's in disarray. And that's why Duncan Lewis resigned. Well, at least he said he was going to resign, so he said, we'll give you a post in Europe rather than have you resign publicly. I think we've got to do some pretty serious thinking about this, and it could be that the US will find that it is, for political and economic reasons as much as strategic ones, constrained in what it will actually do when it comes to South East Asia. We should be watching that space very carefully. I'll try and give as it were, a simple answer, and other people might bounce off it with subsequent questions, I suppose. I think, like many such documents, it was a superficial one. So there was a lot of hand waving and gesturing about the Asian century, but not very much serious analysis. So I didn't see it as leading us anywhere in particular. And the idea that the 21st century will be the Asian century still needs a lot of unpicking. I mean, one way to look at this, it seems to me, I remember saying this to a group of school teachers of Asian studies many years ago. The word Asia itself can mislead us. The word Asia is actually a Western word, not an Asian word. And believe it or not, this is digressing a little bit, I think it's entertaining to tell this. The word Asia, to my knowledge, originally was a Hittite word referring to Western Anatolia. Right? So the people who devised it were looking west, not east, and it was a small region in what's now Turkey. That name stuck, and so the folk to the west, the Greeks and later the Romans, referred to what we now call Turkey as Asia. And then when they realised there's a lot of other stuff further east, they called it Asia Minor. And that stuck for a long time. And everything, all points east from that point, became known as Asia, with sublime disregard of the fact that there were huge differences between the different civilizations in that vast part of the world. And what we're seeing right now is that far from Asia being in any sense a cultural or strategic unity, it's a thicket of different civilizations, polities, festering and often very ancient enmities. The Asian century, well, you've got to, I don't like using the word deconstruct because it goes in the wrong direction, but we need to think long and hard about the particularities and above all relate our interests and autonomy and possible courses of action to those different things. And I didn't see much of that in the Asian century work paper, all of us. It's really rather inscrutable. I mean, the US has been requesting of China for quite some time now to take a more leading role. And China keeps saying it's all very difficult and we'll go softly and just keep talking. And North Korea keeps playing the same old game. I remember being very struck, going there 20 years or so, seeing reports of, shall I say, interesting provenance, indicating that Zhao Ziyan, just before the Tiananmen people, had visited North Korea. And he came back saying to his colleagues, those guys are dinosaurs, the place is a basket case. I mean, they're just very difficult to talk to, they're unreconstructed. On the other hand, well, that was Zhao's perspective. My point is this: Hu Jintao, only I think 3 years ago maybe, publicly said Kim Jong-il has got his economics wrong, but he's got his politics right. In other words, maintaining that ruthless regime in North Korea is perfectly okay as far as he was concerned. And I think that the real game China has been playing is that it doesn't want to see Korean unification. It doesn't want to see an expansion of US influence on the Korean Peninsula. And it's actually finding it handy in a way to have the US and South Korea and Japan so exercised and distracted. But it doesn't want war. So it's playing both ends against the middle. Whether that will be in its long term, of course, remains to be seen. Things could get out of hand. There are many precedents for that. But I do think that Beijing has been playing a somewhat duplicitous game in that respect. Somebody was remarking just before over drinks, but I can't recall who it was or what the source of the information was, but it was to the effect that the Chinese had in fact briefed the North Koreans on what the Americans and South Koreans were telling them regarding negotiations with North Korea. So I think that there's a good deal of evidence to suggest that North Korea is seen as, or as a client state, or at the minimum as a strategic asset by China, rather than being seen in the same light as it is by virtually everybody else, which is a nutty state that's a profound problem. It would be great if it would go away or implode in a costly way, which of course wouldn't happen. If it did implode, it would be a god-awful mess. But just to attend to the final point that you made about, as it were, ignoring the nuclear test, I'm not sure that one can altogether ignore it, but I do think, and perhaps this is the real thrust of the remark, that we have played up to North Korea's game for too long, really, by being reactive. Because, and I argued this in a brief...
That's the essence.
Yes, I mean, I argued this in a brief to very senior defence and foreign affairs people back in '94 when they were, this is just before Kim Jong-il died. And they wanted it because it was clear at that point that North Korea was getting close to developing a nuclear weapon, and they were thinking, is there going to be a war? Will they get a nuclear weapon? What will happen? And I had the sense that for a number of very senior people, there was the belief, really, I'd heard it enunciated, that Kim Jong-il was completely unpredictable and completely crazy. So the thrust of my remarks was that actually that's not true. That his pattern of behaviour for decades has been highly predictable and consistent. He's playing a game. You need to understand how he's playing this game. And if you're worried that he's going to start a war because he's nutty, calm down. If he was going to start the Korean War all over again, he might have done it in the late 70s when he was on the back foot and pulling out of Indochina, and Jimmy Carter was saying he's going to get out of South Korea. There is some evidence that he considered doing it, and then he thought better of it. He's not completely nutty, but what he and his son have done, and there is some evidence that his grandson is now starting to play the same game, is they think we can tease and blackmail and bluff, we keep them scared, we keep them guessing, we get concessions, we get aid. All that's good, and they have no intention of going anywhere. It's a family-run mafia in North Korea. One of the conundrums for defence policy analysts is that if we were to say, let's do that, in some straightforward way, that would leave a gaping hole in our conventional capabilities, which might then be exploited. So one of the difficulties in getting a balanced force structure is having enough of the right kinds of capabilities or combinations of them to cover the contingencies, and hope that something doesn't pop up that you haven't thought of on the blind side you, and of course it frequently does. That said, I think you're onto a good point. I think that the likelihood, to pick up the point made about Japan before, the likelihood of China launching a large-scale invasion of another country, Japan or any other, is pretty remote. I don't think that we should be gearing our defence force for facing a Chinese invasion of continental Australia. But there are various ways in which a potent state with considerable capabilities and as with a malign intent can coerce or pressure others. And the real concern I would have, and there's preliminary evidence of it, is that China renewed and is beginning to use its increasing power to try and bully its way to regional dominance. One reading of its repeated statements that it intends to rise peacefully is that it will indeed rise peacefully provided everybody else steps back and accommodates as well. Of course it will. But there are signs that if they don't, then there could be trouble. And the hawkish elements in China are disturbingly outspoken at times these days. Among the friends I mentioned in Melbourne, who, as I say, have spent a lot of time in China and speak the language, this was a particular concern. And as I said, these are not hawkish people. These are people who have taken years to understand China and are very fond of China in a lot of ways. But they're hearing these hawkish voices, and in particular, they said they have had conversations with people who, as it were, ought to know better, who were saying, we were at war with Japan, and the Americans got in the way and sort of imposed an armistice. Well, that war's not over, and we're going to finish it. Now, that's not being articulated yet as state policy, but the mere fact that that kind of sentiment would be articulated by educated and well-to-do Chinese has got to be worrying. So I guess my answer to your question is we need to look long and hard at the spectrum of possibilities and our potential vulnerabilities and address them seriously. The current government, it seems to me, is just all over the shop in that respect. whenever there is a situation of the kind we have now, there are of course various voices, various debates, and as I emphasised, various possibilities. And so I began by saying that some of my friends were expressing concern at what they had heard from Chinese interlocutors. And the concern was that there could be war, and we've had Kevin Rudd saying the same. And I think it's true to say that there could be, and it may not be because Xi Jinping is planning a war. The most disastrous wars, all too many of them occur not because somebody has planned them, but because they've got into a situation from which, from a point of view of what people like to call face, they don't think they can back down. They think that they have to stand firm, but so does the other party, and the shooting starts, and then they can't stop it. That's what, I mean, the First World War was very much that way. So I think the thing we have to tackle here at the moment is there is tension and there are many sources of confrontation, and whether or not it's bluffing, and regardless of what some of its emissaries say, to use the expression from the Australian Marine, to mollify their neighbours, we need more reassurance, we need more confidence building measures if the situation is to be diffused and not to get out of hand. This is a very long-standing, and perhaps the best way to address it is this. A couple of months ago, Paul Keating gave the Keith Murdoch oration, and he came out with a startling suggestion that Australia should basically detach itself from the US alliance, which it has spent too much time managing for decades, and seek to make Indonesia our greatest strategic partner, which he said would be natural and workable and good and modest. And I wrote a rejoinder term which was published in The Age, in which I said that it's a rather curious idea coming from a former Prime Minister, when you consider that all the roles that the United States plays as a senior ally in terms of intelligence linkages, diplomatic access, military equipment, nuclear deterrence cover, a global architecture, etc. Indonesia could not provide any of these things. So what's he playing at? What does he really think Indonesia is going to do as our major strategic partner? There's a lot to be said for being good friends with Indonesia and deepening the relationship, particularly because of the trade routes going through their straits. But that'll take some time. And if he thinks managing the alliance with the US has been problematic, when we speak the same language and been allies for more than half a century, I'm not sure what's going through his mind when he thinks that we can just structure a good, manageable relationship with Indonesia and everything will be fine and dandy. The Australian Defence Force has, for the longest time, sought to have modern and advanced technological equipment that would enable it to punch above its weight if push came to shove in a regional conflict. Now, if we detach ourselves from the US alliance, there's no way to substitute for that. And even as it is, we are struggling a little now because so many regional states are becoming richer and they're putting money into their military. So we've got a lot of hard thinking to do about, well, where do we sit in relation to those different regional militaries? What capabilities do we really want? And how much are we prepared to spend to have them? And I think that the problem with the 2009 white paper is that it seemed to go over the top without carefully explaining its thinking. And then with still a Labor government, a change of Prime Minister, and for apparently domestic political reasons, nothing to do with grand strategy, they just toss that overboard, or at least in financial terms they do, while claiming they're still going to get all those platforms. How they're going to do it and pay for it, no explanation. So I don't think, to put it briefly, I don't think that there's any straightforward or practical way to detach ourselves from the US alliance, but we could, to pick up Paul Keating's remark, think seriously about how to manage it better, participate in it responsibly and perhaps with greater autonomy. But to do that really thoughtfully and at the same time think through what capabilities do we think we need if we're to be reasonably self-reliant. There's no brief way, of course, to answer that question because it raises so many interesting and complex issues. But let me say this as one way of looking at it. Since the Second World War, the aspiration of the United Nations, the creation of which was largely sponsored by the United States, has been to foster collective security in the world so that there won't be major conflicts and so that rogue states by any other name can be corralled. It, from that point of view, has been dysfunctional. It just has never effectively achieved that role any more than CETO did. I remember it being said of CETO that when there was a regional crisis, CETO would get together, express concern, issue a reassuring memorandum and do nothing. What happens in the UN Security Council is that one of the major powers, normally China or Russia, has always vetoed collective action with one interesting exception. Well, the question is, when it comes to collective security, as distinct perhaps from sanctions or reproofs, but here's the thing, that hasn't worked. And whenever the UN, more generally, has agreed, at least over the veto of China or Russia, that something needs to be done in the theatre, they always look to the United States because nobody else can do the heavy lifting. But nobody. You know, and occasionally the US has said, look, why is it always us? They said to the Europeans in the case of Yugoslavia, it's your backyard, take responsibility, step up to the plate. Well, they made a meal of it, and they kept bleeding. Now, what about the Americans? Come in, you know, we need the help, we need your equipment, we don't have it. So I think it's a very difficult thing. I would be sympathetic to a certain extent with those many Americans who have thought from time to time, why would we bother? Right? We don't get any thanks for it. It's vastly expensive. We should spend the money on a domestic economy. It's probably more of the sentiment around now than it has been for quite a while. But who else would step up to the plate, and with what consequences? That really what it brings up short. And here's the other thing to consider. Over the last decade, despite the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, US defence expenditure has started to trend down. China's defence expenditure has been going up by double-digit increments every year, faster than its GDP is growing. Now, one explanation for that is that China is trying to systematically modernise its military, and it wants a military which is state-of-the-art, and in certain respects as good as that of the Americans. Abstractly speaking, who could deny that right, if you like? But the implications are very considerable, and China's not taking care of anybody's security but its own. It's not out there for collective security. It's not backing or supporting Japan or Europe. It's not providing nuclear deterrence cover for anybody. It's looking after number one, and it's saying that it's going to look after number one. So what we have to do as a regional state is think to ourselves, well, it might be that that's going to be okay. It might be they only have benign intentions, but if they're getting so much stronger so fast, and if the US is on the back foot economically, and we've cut our defence budget, we're out there, you know, hoping things will be okay. I'm just not real comfortable with that approach.